The front gates of the Carter estate swung open with a slow creak. Brent Carter's black SUV rolled up the long driveway, tires crunching over the gravel. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. His trip to New York had been cut short. A storm had grounded flights, and he had decided, on a whim, to surprise his son. It was almost sunset. The mansion's white walls glowed in the orange light. Brent's briefcase sat on the passenger seat, his mind replaying one thought. Eli will be so happy to see me. He parked, stepped out, and pulled his keys from his pocket. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Brent pushed open the front door. A faint thud echoed somewhere upstairs. Then a small, muffled whimper. His pulse quickened. He called out, "Eli?" No answer. As he walked deeper into the hallway, the silence pressed in on him. Then, turning the corner, he froze. At the base of the staircase, Eli was crouched low, his small body trembling, tiny arms over his head as if protecting himself. Towering over him was Maya Williams, the family's live-in housekeeper. Her hand was gripping Eli's arm. In her other hand, a white towel streaked with blood at one end. Brent's briefcase slipped from his grasp and hit the marble floor with a heavy thud. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the three of them. His breathing slowed, his jaw clenched. "I said," Brent's voice was low but shaking with fury, "let go of my son." Maya's eyes widened. She immediately released Eli. The boy bolted toward his father, throwing himself into Brent's chest, sobbing into his shirt. Brent bent down, his arms wrapping protectively around his son. He pulled back just enough to see Eli's tear-streaked face, then his eyes locked on the swelling on the boy's forehead. It was red, angry-looking, and fresh. Brent's blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned his gaze back to Maya. "What the hell happened?" "Mr. Carter, please." Maya's voice was shaky. "He slipped in the bathroom. I was just trying to help him up." Brent pointed sharply at the towel in her hand. "You call this help? You think I'm stupid?" "No," Maya said, her voice firming. "But there's something you don't understand." "I understand enough," Brent cut in, pulling Eli closer. He didn't know if he was angrier at the sight in front of him, or the way a strange, unshakable dread was starting to crawl through his gut. Brent's grip on Eli tightened as if he feared his son might slip away if he loosened his hold even for a second. His mind raced, but every thought was drowned out by the image he had just walked in on. His son trembling in fear, a blood-streaked towel in the maid's hand. The man who built empires with quick, calculated decisions now felt something dangerous rising inside him, something far less measured. Rage, protective, unyielding rage. Maya stood rooted to the spot, her dark eyes wide but not exactly pleading. There was something behind them, an urgency, almost desperation, but Brent was in no mood to decode it. "You're fired," he said coldly, his voice like a blade slicing through the still air. The words dropped between them with a finality that made even the massive hall feel smaller. Maya shook her head, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry conviction. "Mr. Carter, you don't understand. Eli was hurt before I even got to him. I heard the crash from the laundry room. When I got there, he was on the floor, dazed, bleeding. I grabbed the towel to stop the blood." "Stop," Brent interrupted sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You expect me to believe that? That I just happened to come home at the exact moment you were, what, comforting him? Is that what you call standing over him while he cowers like that?" His voice was rising now, echoing against the marble and high ceilings. "I've trusted you in my home, around my son for over a year. And this is what I find?" Eli whimpered softly, pressing his face into his father's suit jacket, and Brent felt a pang of guilt for letting the argument play out in front of him. But the sight of that swelling on his boy's forehead reignited his fury. He turned his gaze back to Maya, and for a fleeting second something almost like pain flickered across her face. "Mr. Carter," Maya began again, her tone calmer now, almost plea. Ding, but still laced with something unshakably firm. "If you'll just listen for a minute, I can explain everything. There's more going on than you realize." Brent laughed bitterly, a humorless, sharp sound. "Explain? You think there's an explanation that makes this look right? You think any story you tell me right now is going to erase the image of my son scared out of his mind with you standing over him? No, Maya, I don't need your explanation. I need you to pack your things and get out of my house. She didn't move. Her chin lifted slightly, defiance glinting in her eyes despite the tension in her shoulders. I can't leave, she said quietly, and the words landed in the space between them like a foreign language Brent didn't want to translate. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Excuse me? I can't leave, she repeated, her voice stronger now. Not yet. Not until you hear the truth. And when you do, you'll realize that firing me is the least of your problems. Brent's chest tightened. He didn't like the way she said it, measured, certain, as though she was holding something over him. A man like Brent Carter was used to control, to knowing every angle, every risk. Yet in that moment, he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into the edges of his mind. Doubt. Daniel Hayes' voice echoed in his memory, his old friend's warning just a few weeks ago. Be careful who you trust, Brent. Sometimes the people you think are the safest are the ones carrying the most dangerous truths. He shook it off and straightened his shoulders. You have 1 minute, he said flatly. 1, and then you're gone. Maya took a deep breath, her eyes locked on his, steady and unwavering. Then you should probably sit down, Mr. Carter, she said, her voice low but clear. Because what I'm about to tell you, it's about Eli, and it's about someone in this house who doesn't want him alive. Brent's heartbeat thudded so loudly he almost missed the soft gasp that escaped his own lips. The words lodged in his mind, sharp and unmovable. Doesn't want him alive. And suddenly the blood on the towel didn't feel like the only danger in his home. Brent remained standing, refusing to give Maya the satisfaction of seeing him unsettled. Yet his mind couldn't ignore the weight of her words. The marble floor beneath his polished shoes suddenly felt colder, the grand chandelier above casting long, uneasy shadows on the walls. He had built his empire on numbers and facts, things that could be proven, measured, controlled. And yet here was his housekeeper, a woman he had barely spoken to beyond polite exchanges and instructions, claiming that someone in his own home wanted his only child dead. It was so absurd, so outrageous, that part of him wanted to laugh it off. But there was something in her tone, calm, deliberate, devoid of any trace of panic, that kept him silent. Maya stepped forward, just enough to close the distance between them without breaching the invisible barrier Brent's posture had created. I've been noticing things, she began, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from him. Not once, but over weeks. Small things at first. Eli's toys being moved to the top of the stairs where he could trip, his bathroom floor left wet after I'd just dried it, sharp objects left where a 6-year-old's curious hands could find them. She paused, watching his face for any sign of belief. I told myself it was carelessness. I didn't want to imagine the alternative, but after what happened today, her eyes flicked briefly to the swelling on Eli's forehead. I can't ignore it anymore. Brent tightened his hold on Eli, feeling the small heartbeat against his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to dismiss her. Yet as a father, he couldn't deny the unease building in, his gut. He remembered Eli's recent scrapes and bruises, the times the boy had said he'd fallen or slipped, and how Brent had barely questioned it, attributing it to childhood clumsiness. The thought that any of it might have been deliberate sent a slow, cold burn through his veins. You're making dangerous accusations, Brent said, his voice low but firm. If you're lying, Maya. I'm not lying, she interrupted, not with defiance, but with the absolute conviction of someone who had nothing left to lose. And I can prove it, but you need to let me show you. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small black flash drive, placing it on the table beside the staircase. Everything I've seen, everything I've recorded, it's on here, but you have to look at it alone. If the person I'm talking about realizes you know, they'll stop hiding, and then they'll act faster. Brent stared at the flash drive, its plastic casing looking almost harmless. Yet he knew from years of high-stakes negotiations that the most unassuming objects could contain the most devastating truths. His thoughts raced through every possible suspect, staff members, contractors, even distant relatives who occasionally visited. But there was one name that lingered in his mind longer than the others, someone who had access to every room in the house, someone he had trusted implicitly for years. "Maya," he said, his tone sharpened by suspicion, "why not come to me sooner? Why wait until my son is hurt to say any of this?" Her gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. "Because I didn't have proof until now, and because I knew what you'd think of me. The black maid making wild claims against people you trust. I've seen that look in your eyes before, Mr. Carter. I didn't want it again." She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking briefly toward Eli before returning to him. "But I'd rather you hate me and keep him safe than stay silent and watch something happen to him." Before he could respond, a sharp sound echoed from upstairs. A door slamming, heavy footsteps, the faint creak of floorboards. Brent's head snapped up toward the staircase. Eli's small fingers gripped his jacket tighter. Maya's voice was low, urgent. "They're still here." In that moment, the opulent, carefully guarded mansion no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap. Brent's eyes locked on the shadowy curve of the staircase, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to spring. The sound of footsteps above was deliberate, not hurried, not stealthy, just steady enough to suggest the person walking didn't care if they were heard. That unnerved him more than if they had been trying to sneak away. Whoever it was, they had no fear of being discovered. In a home where Brent controlled every detail, that kind of boldness was not just alarming, it was insulting. He glanced at Maya, whose gaze had already shifted upward, her expression unreadable, but her body tense as if bracing for something inevitable. He placed Eli gently on the sofa beside the staircase, kneeling so he was at eye level with his son. "Stay here. Don't move, no matter what you hear," Brent instructed, his voice low but commanding. Eli nodded quickly, his small hands clutching the cushions as if they were a lifeline. Brent stood, his eyes narrowing as the shadow of a figure emerged at the top of the stairs. The light from the hallway above caught on the polished railing, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of Paul Whitman, Brent's longtime property manager and one of the few people who had unrestricted access to the house. Paul descended the stairs slowly, his steps deliberate, his eyes shifting between Brent and Maya. He was a man in his late 40s with a practiced, easy smile that Brent had once trusted without hesitation. But tonight, that smile didn't come. Instead, Paul's face was set in an expression that Brent couldn't quite place, somewhere between annoyance and quiet calculation. "Mr. Carter," Paul greeted in a voice that was calm, almost too calm. "I didn't know you were back early." His eyes slid briefly toward Eli on the sofa, then to the flash drive still sitting on the table. Brent's instincts prickled. He had seen enough boardroom betrayals to recognize the subtle dance of a man trying to gauge what the other side knew. "I wasn't planning to be," Brent replied evenly, not breaking eye contact. "What are you doing here this late?" Paul's lips curved into a faint smirk, but his tone remained polite. "Routine check. You know I make sure everything's secure when you're away." Maya stepped forward slightly, and Brent caught the quick exchange of looks between her and Paul. It wasn't the glance of casual acquaintances. There was history there, unspoken, tense. "Mr. Carter," Maya said carefully, "Paul's the one I've been trying to tell you about." The words landed heavy, and Brent felt the air in the room shift. Paul chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Really, Maya? That's your play? Blame me for whatever trouble you've gotten yourself into?" He looked at Brent, his expression dripping with condescension. "She's been acting paranoid for weeks. I didn't want to bother you with it, but clearly, she's decided to take her stories straight to you." Brent's mind was a storm of conflicting signals. Paul had been in his employment for over a decade, handling everything from property maintenance to security logistics. If Maya was lying, it meant she was willing to throw a long-trusted employee under the bus without hesitation. But if she was telling the truth, then he had allowed a threat to live inside his home for years. Maya's voice cut through his thoughts, sharper now. "Tell him where you were 2 nights ago, Paul. Go ahead. Tell him why Eli's bedroom window was unlocked at midnight." For the first time, Paul's expression shifted. It was brief, so brief Brent might have missed it if he weren't watching closely. But there it was, a flicker of something defensive, almost predatory before the mask of calm returned. "I think you've been watching too many crime dramas," Paul said smoothly. "Or maybe you're just looking for a way to keep your job after he sees you manhandling his kid." Brent's attention was pulled in two directions, his gaze moving between the two of them. He didn't trust Maya yet, but he couldn't ignore the small, telling cracks in Paul's demeanor. And there was the flash drive, silent, sitting between them like an unexploded device waiting for someone to trigger it. "Both of you," Brent said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. "Sit down." He stepped toward the flash drive, picking it up and holding it between his fingers. "We're going to see exactly what's on this. And if either of you is lying to me, you'll regret it." Paul's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Maya simply nodded, her expression grim. Eli shifted nervously on the sofa, sensing the storm that was about to break. Brent didn't yet know it, but the moment he plugged that flash drive into his laptop, the illusion of safety he had built around his son and his home would shatter completely. Brent carried the flash drive into his study, the one room in the mansion where he did all his thinking. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books, and the faint scent of cigar smoke lingered from nights he'd spent alone in here. Tonight, however, the air felt different, charged, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He moved to the massive oak desk, setting the flash drive down in front of his laptop. Behind him, Maya stood near the door, arms crossed, while Paul leaned casually against the wall with a posture that screamed Ahmed forced nonchalance. Eli was in the living room with the TV on low, but Brent's ears stayed tuned for any sound from him. When the laptop screen came alive, Brent plugged the flash drive into the side port. A single folder appeared, labeled simply, E, Protected. The naming made his stomach tighten. He double-clicked, and a series of time-stamped video files popped up, each marked with the room name and date. They spanned weeks. Without a word, he opened the earliest one. The footage was from the upstairs hallway camera, a feed Brent didn't even know existed. The angle caught Eli's bedroom door partially open. After a few quiet seconds, a shadow slid into frame. Paul's figure appeared, moving slowly, carrying something small in his right hand. He stopped at Eli's door, glanced up and down the hall, then reached for the doorknob. Brent's eyes narrowed, watching as Paul pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The footage ended abruptly. Brent clicked the next file. This one was from the kitchen 2 weeks later. Eli sat at the counter with a bowl of cereal. Maya's voice could be faintly heard in the background, humming while washing dishes. Paul entered, poured something from a small vial into the milk carton on the counter, then glanced toward the sink before stepping out of frame. Brent's pulse kicked up, his mind already connecting dots he didn't want to connect. The third video hit harder. It was from just 3 nights ago, Eli's bathroom. The feed showed the tile floor freshly mopped, but seconds later, Paul entered with a small bucket, poured water deliberately across the tiles, and walked out. Minutes later, Eli could be heard crying off camera, followed by Maya rushing in to help him. Brent's mind was a battlefield of fury, guilt, and icy calculation. The man standing in front of him was not just an employee anymore, he was a threat. And threats had to be dealt with decisively. But Paul wasn't cornered yet. His calmness was returning, and that worried Brent. Calm men in dangerous situations often meant they still had a card to play. As if on cue, Paul's gaze slid toward the living room. "You might want to check on your son," he said with unsettling casualness. "Because while we've been in here talking, I'm not the only one in this house." Brent felt the floor drop beneath him. His mind screamed a single thought: Eli. He was already moving before the chair fully scraped back. Brent's heart slammed against his ribs as he tore out of the study, the hallway seeming longer than it ever had before. Every instinct screamed at him to get to Eli, to put himself between his son and whatever danger had just been hinted at. His polished shoes pounded against the marble, his breaths coming in hard, clipped bursts. The mansion's elegant silence, the kind he once prized, now felt suffocating, a hollow shell echoing with the possibilities of what might be happening just beyond his line of sight. He could feel Maya's footsteps close behind him, lighter and quicker, while Paul's slower, deliberate pace followed further back, the sound of a predator in no hurry to chase prey it already believed cornered. When Brent reached the edge of the living room, his eyes swept the space in a single practiced glance, the way he had done in countless high-stakes meetings when he needed to read a room instantly. Eli was no longer curled up on the sofa. The cushions were dented, a small blanket crumpled on the floor, and the muted glow of the television cast long, flickering shadows across the carpet. A bowl of snacks had tipped over, spilling crumbs like a trail toward the far way. Brent's stomach tightened with a visceral, unfamiliar fear. This wasn't business. This wasn't negotiation. This was primal. Eli, his voice cut through the air, sharper than he intended, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. No answer. He strode toward the hallway, scanning each doorway. The house was too quiet again. That same oppressive stillness he had walked into earlier, only now it carried a sinister edge. He pushed open the door to the dining room. Empty. The kitchen, empty, though the back door was slightly ajar, letting in a thin draft of night air. Then, from upstairs, came a sound that made his blood run cold. A muffled cry, small and panicked, the kind a child makes when they're trying not to be heard but can't hold back. Without thinking, Brent sprinted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. Maya was right on his heels, her breathing sharp but controlled, while Paul remained below, his voice floating up after them in a calm, mocking drawl. "I told you, Carter, it was never just me." Brent didn't waste time responding. He reached the landing and followed the sound toward the far guest bedroom. The door was closed, but the faint shuffle of movement inside betrayed someone's presence. He gripped the handle and shoved it open with a force that made it bang against the wall. Inside, Eli sat on the bed, his small hands tied in front of him with what looked like a silk scarf from the wardrobe. His eyes were wide, shimmering with tears, but more than fear, there was confusion in them. He didn't understand why this was happening. Standing just a few feet away from him was a woman Brent didn't recognize. She was tall, with sharp cheekbones and blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore black gloves and moved with the unhurried precision of someone who believed she was in control. In her right hand was a small vial, clear liquid catching the lamplight. "Step away from him," Brent said, his voice low but thrumming with barely contained fury. The woman smiled faintly as though she had expected him. "Mr. Carter, finally, we meet." Her accent was faintly Eastern European, her tone almost cordial. "Your friend Paul was supposed to keep you busy a little longer, but no matter, we can finish this quickly." Maya moved to Brent's side, her stance tense and ready, while Brent kept his focus on the woman. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Let's just say I'm here to settle a debt," she replied smoothly, her eyes flicking toward Eli. "And unfortunately for you, the payment is in blood." Brent took a step forward, every fiber of him poised to lunge, but she raised the vial higher, tilting it as if she might pour it onto Eli. "One more step and he's gone before you can touch me," she warned, her tone cold and matter-of-fact. For a moment the room was locked in stillness, the air thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken calculations. Brent's mind raced. How close he was to her, how fast he could cross the distance, whether Maya could move in time. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except the sight of his son's tear-filled eyes. Then without warning, Maya stepped forward, not toward the woman, but toward Eli. "You don't want to do this," she said quietly, her voice steady, her gaze locked on the intruder, "because you're not walking out of this house if you try." The woman's eyes narrowed, reading Maya as a threat she hadn't accounted for. That half-second of distraction was all Brent needed. In one explosive motion, he closed the gap, grabbing her wrist and twisting it hard enough to make the vial slip from her grip. Maya caught it before it hit the floor, tossing it safely out of reach. Eli scrambled toward Brent, who pulled him close with one arm while keeping his other locked around the woman's wrist. Footsteps pounded up the stairs, Paul finally deciding to join the confrontation. But now, Brent was ready. He had proof of Paul's betrayal, the would-be attacker in his grasp and his son safe against his chest. The rage that had been simmering since the moment he'd walked into his home was no longer just fury. It was a plan, and Brent Carter was a man who never lost when he had a plan. Paul stopped in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the scene. Brent holding the blonde woman in a steel grip, Eli clinging to his father's side, and Maya standing with her shoulders squared, the captured vial still in her hand. For the first time since Brent had known him, Paul's mask cracked entirely. The easy charm, the calm arrogance, they were gone. In their place was something far more primal, frustration at a plan unraveling. "You've made a mistake, Brent," Paul said, his voice low, almost dangerous. "You think you've won because you caught her, but you have no idea how deep this goes." Brent tightened his hold on the woman, feeling the tension in her muscles as she tested his grip. "Oh, I think I've seen enough," he said, his voice controlled but vibrating with restrained fury. "I've got weeks of footage showing you sabotaging my son's safety. I've got your accomplice here, in my house, with whatever poison she was planning to use. That's more than enough to bury both of you." Paul took a slow step forward, and Maya instinctively moved to block him, her stance protective. "Stay where you are," she warned, her voice like iron. It was then that Brent noticed something in her eyes, a sharpness, a readiness, that told him she was far more than just a housekeeper. "You know," Paul said, his gaze shifting between Maya and Brent, "I kept telling Victor that bringing her into the picture was a bad idea. She's too unpredictable." He smirked faintly. "Tell him, Maya. Tell him why you really took this job." Brent's eyes flicked to her, confusion mixing with the adrenaline surging through him. Maya's jaw clenched, but her voice didn't waver. "I took this job because Victor Aldrin put a price on your son's head," she said evenly. "I worked my way into this house to protect him, not just as a job, but because I owed someone a debt. Your wife." Brent froze. "My wife?" Maya nodded, her eyes softening just slightly. "Years ago, before you even knew me, your wife pulled me out of a situation I didn't think I'd survive. She helped me start over, gave me a second chance at life. When I heard what Victor was planning, I couldn't just stand by. I made sure I was the one hired here so I could be close enough to stop it. Every time Paul tried something, I was there to undo it before it went too far. Today was the first time I didn't get to Eli in time to prevent him from being hurt. But I still stopped it from being worse." The weight of her words sank into Brent's chest like a stone. He had spent the last hour doubting her, accusing her, even trying to throw her out, all while she had been risking everything for his son. His grip on the blonde woman didn't loosen, but his gaze on Maya shifted entirely. From suspicion to something that looked very much like respect. Paul's smirk faltered. "Touching story," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "But it won't matter. Victor has more people, more ways. You can't watch him forever." Brent stepped forward, forcing the blonde woman toward Paul, his voice dropping into the tone that had ended careers and bankrupted rivals. "Maybe not forever, but I can make sure neither of you sees daylight again for a very long time." He yanked a phone from his pocket, dialing a direct line he almost never used. "Detective Harlow," he said when the voice answered. "This is Brent Carter. I have 2 individuals in my home involved in an attempted murder. Our plot against my son. I have physical evidence and security footage. Get here now." Paul's face went still, realizing Brent wasn't bluffing. The blonde woman's breathing quickened, her earlier poise unraveling. Maya stepped closer to Eli, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder, keeping herself between him and the intruders until the sound of approaching sirens began to cut through the heavy night air. When the police arrived, the arrest was swift and decisive. Paul and the woman were taken out in handcuffs, their protests swallowed by the flashing lights. Brent gave his statement calmly, his voice steady despite the churn of emotions inside him. The flash drive was bagged as evidence, and the vial was secured. The officers treated the situation with the gravity it deserved. This wasn't just a break-in, it was the dismantling of a targeted attack on a child. Later, after the last cruiser had pulled away and the mansion was quiet again, Brent sat in the living room with Eli asleep in his lap. Maya stood nearby, her posture finally relaxing now that the immediate danger had passed. For a moment, Brent simply looked at her, seeing not the employee he had misjudged, but the woman who had quite literally saved his son's life. "I owe you more than an apology," he said finally, his voice low. "I owe you everything." Maya shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. You owe your wife. I just kept the promise I made to her." Brent nodded slowly, his throat tight. He thought of his late wife, how she had always seemed to see the good in people he overlooked. She had been right about Maya, just as she had been right about so many things. From that night on, Maya was no longer just the housekeeper. She became a permanent part of their lives, Eli's guardian in ways that went beyond a job description. And though Brent never forgot the fear of that evening, he also never forgot. At the moment he learned that sometimes, the people we doubt the most are the very ones keeping us alive.